When I was going through my dead husband's things, I found an envelope with an address and a key. Inside was a note. Come alone. Don't bring the children. I went to that address. What I saw behind that door turned my life upside down. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Dorothy Ellen Whitmore, and I am 72 years old. I was married to Richard for 44 years. And for 44 years, I believed I knew that man down to the last crease in his worn leather wallet. We raised 2 children in a yellow house on Maple Creek Road in Asheville, North Carolina. Every April, we planted a garden together. We argued about whose turn it was to pay the electric bill and whose turn it was to say sorry first. That is what a real marriage looks like. Ordinary, imperfect, and deeply familiar. Richard died on a Tuesday in February. Heart attack. He was shoveling snow off the porch, which I had asked him not to do, and his heart simply stopped. He was 69 years old. The paramedic said he probably felt very little. I told myself that was a mercy, though in the weeks that followed, I was not sure mercy was the right word for any of it. After the funeral, after the casserole stopped coming and the sympathy cards stopped arriving, and the house became very quiet in a way I had never known before, I began the job of sorting through Richard's belongings. It is something no one prepares you for, how personal it feels. Every drawer you open, every jacket you take off a hanger, every old receipt you unfold, feels like a small conversation with someone who can no longer answer. I started with his study. Richard had been a careful man, a retired civil engineer, and his desk was arranged the way his mind had been arranged, logical, organized, nothing out of place. I went through the files slowly, one folder at a time. Tax returns, insurance papers, the deed to the house, a folder marked retirement that held nothing but an old brochure for a fishing resort in Montana. I smiled at that. He had always talked about Montana. It was in the bottom drawer, under a stack of old utility bills, that I found the envelope. It was a plain white envelope, letter-sized, sealed. My name was not on it. Nothing was written on the outside at all. But when I turned it over, a small brass key slid out from inside. It was the kind of key used for a lockbox or a storage unit. There was also a folded note and a piece of paper with an address written in Richard's handwriting. The address was on the other side of town, on a street I did not know. The note was short, 4 sentences. I read it while standing at his desk, and I read it again sitting down. And I read it a 3rd time after I had poured myself a glass of water and tried to steady my hands. Dorothy, if you're reading this, I'm already gone. Go to this address. Go alone. Do not bring the children. Do not bring the children. I sat with those 4 words for a long time. Richard and I had 2 children, our son Michael, who was 43, and our daughter Patricia, who lived in Portland and had always been the steadier one. Richard loved them both. Why would he leave a note telling me to keep them away from whatever was behind that door? I told myself it was probably nothing frightening, maybe a storage unit, some private money matter he had wanted to handle quietly. Men from his generation sometimes kept things in separate boxes in their minds, not because they meant to deceive, but because they were used to protecting people, because they believed making the people you loved worry was a kind of failure. I told myself this several times, but I also noticed that my hands were still not fully steady. I put the envelope, the key, and the note into the pocket of my cardigan and went to make dinner. I made too much, as I always did now, and I ate alone at the kitchen table with the television on for company. Outside, the February darkness came early and complete. That night, I did not sleep well. I lay in the bed that still smelled faintly like Richard's soap, and I stared at the ceiling, and I thought about that address. I thought about the exact words in the note. Not you don't need to bring the children, but do not bring the children. There is a difference. One is a suggestion. The other is a warning. By morning, I still had made no decision. But I had also put the envelope in my purse, which is its own kind of decision, isn't it? 3 days passed before I did anything. In those 3 days, I cooked meals I barely ate, answered phone calls from Patricia and from Michael's wife, Karen, who called more often than Patricia did and asked more questions than Patricia did. And I sat in Richard's study for long stretches of time, doing nothing in particular. Grief is strange that way. It does not move in a straight line. 1 hour you are functioning, and the next you are standing in front of the open refrigerator trying to remember what you came for. Karen called on Wednesday morning. She was caring, as she had been since the funeral. Bringing food, offering to help organize the paperwork, asking whether Richard had left any documents she should know about. She and Michael had power of attorney over some financial accounts, an arrangement Richard had set up 2 years ago when he had a small health scare. At the time, it had seemed practical. Now, standing in the kitchen with the phone pressed to my ear and the envelope sitting in my purse on the counter, I noticed something I had never noticed before. Karen asked about documents the way a person asks about something they are already searching for. "Has the estate attorney been in touch?" she asked. "Not yet," I said. "You should call him soon. These things have timelines." "I'm aware, Karen." There was a short pause. "Of course. I just want to make sure you're not overwhelmed. Michael and I can handle a lot of this if you need us to." I thanked her and ended the call. I stood in the kitchen for a moment after that. Karen had always been efficient. She was a real estate agent, good at her job, comfortable with paperwork and transactions. I had never exactly disliked her, but I had also never completely warmed to her. There was something about the way she moved through a room, purposeful, aware of what was valuable, that had always made me feel, without being able to explain why, slightly observed. That afternoon, I drove to the address on Richard's note. I told no one. I simply got in my car, typed the address into my phone's map, and drove. It was a neighborhood of houses I had driven through before, but never stopped in. Modest homes, well kept, the kind of street where people mow their lawns on Saturday mornings. The address led me to a small gray house at the end of a cul-de-sac. 1 story, a covered porch, window boxes, though it was February and the boxes were empty. The driveway was empty. There was a mailbox at the end of the walk. I sat in my car for several minutes. Then I got out, walked to the door, and used the brass key. The door opened. What I found inside was not what I had feared. No proof of a second family, no pictures of strangers on the walls, no woman's clothes in the closets. What I found was one clean room turned into a private workspace, a small desk, a filing cabinet, a safe built into the wall behind a framed watercolor of the Blue Ridge Mountains, and on the desk, a sealed envelope with my name on it written in Richard's hand. I sat down in the desk chair and opened it. The letter was 4 pages long, handwritten, and it told me things that changed the shape of everything I thought I understood about the last 2 years of my marriage. Richard had found out, 14 months before he died, that Michael and Karen had been slowly moving money out of a joint investment account, one Richard had started decades earlier and meant entirely to pass to me as part of his estate. They had not stolen it in a simple way. They had done something more hidden. Karen, using her real estate connections, had helped arrange a series of transfers disguised as investments, shell purchases, consulting fees, loans on paper that were never meant to be paid back. The total, Richard estimated, was somewhere between $2 and $250,000. He had found this by accident. He had not confronted them. He had been afraid, not for himself, but for what it would do to our family, to Patricia, to the grandchildren. And he had been, he wrote, deeply ashamed that he had not acted sooner, that he had let his fear of the family breaking apart outweigh his duty to protect what was mine. The safe held documents, account statements, printed emails, a USB drive. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you while I was alive," he wrote near the end of the letter. "I was a coward about this." "You never were. Trust yourself." I folded the letter, put it back in its envelope, and sat very still for a long time. Then I opened the safe. The safe held exactly what Richard had promised. A manila folder contained 12 months of printed bank statements for an investment account I had not known still existed in this form. What had once been a joint account Richard and I opened in 1987 had gone through a series of changes I had never been asked to approve, changed so that Michael held co-signing status. The statements showed a pattern so clear it almost looked foolish. Regular withdrawals in amounts just under the level that would trigger an automatic bank review, sent into 3 different accounts. 2 of those accounts, when matched with the printed emails Richard had saved, were linked to a company registered under Karen's maiden name. The USB drive held more scanned documents, a chain of emails between Karen and a contact she called only DW, a name I did not know, talking about moving assets and the importance of finishing the transfers before the estate situation becomes complicated. The newest email in the chain was dated 11 days before Richard died. I sat at that desk in the house for almost 2 hours. I read everything twice. I took pictures of each page with my phone. I copied the contents of the USB drive into a folder in my phone's cloud storage using the Wi-Fi network Richard had set up. The password was written on a sticky note inside the safe door in his neat engineer's handwriting. By the time I locked the house and drove away, I had made my decision. I would not call Michael. I would not call Karen. I would not, under any circumstances, let them know what I had found until I had spoken to a lawyer. Not the estate attorney Richard and I had used for our wills, because that attorney had also been copied on some of the paperwork for changing the account, and I did not yet know what part he had played. I needed someone new, someone who owed nothing to anyone in my family. I drove home and spent that evening looking up estate and probate lawyers in Asheville. I made a list of 4. I crossed off the first because his office had done work for Karen's brokerage in the past. I found that in a footnote on a Chamber of Commerce event page. I crossed off the second because, according to his firm's website, he had retired. The third was a woman named Sandra Okafor, who had been practicing for 22 years and whose firm's reviews described her as thorough and, in one especially useful review, not intimidated by difficult family situations. I called her office the next morning and made an appointment for Friday. It was Thursday when Karen's behavior changed. I did not go back to the gray house again that week, but I did drive past it once while running an errand that took me through that neighborhood, and I noticed a car parked 2 houses down that I was almost sure I had seen before. A silver Audi that Karen drove when she was not using her work car. It may have been a coincidence. The neighborhood was not private, but I noticed it. That evening, Karen called again. The tone was different, still warm, still helpful, but with something new under it, a quiet urgency I could not quite name. "Mom," she said. She had called me Mom since the first year of her marriage to Michael, and I had always had mixed feelings about it. "I was thinking about coming over this weekend to help go through Richard's study, just to make sure nothing gets accidentally thrown away before the estate is sorted out." "That's thoughtful," I said, "but I've already gone through the study." A pause, short, but there. "Oh, did you find everything in order?" "Everything I needed," I said. Another pause. "Of course. Well, if you need any help with the filing cabinet or any of those old account documents, I've got it handled, Karen." "But thank you." I hung up. Had I handled it with total calm? No. My voice had been steady, but my heart had been doing something unpleasant in my chest. I had been married to a civil engineer for 44 years. And one thing that man had taught me without ever meaning to was the importance of what he called load-bearing information. The piece of information that, if removed, makes everything above it fall apart. Karen was looking for the safe, or she was looking for whatever Richard had left behind. She did not yet know whether I had found it, but she was beginning to suspect that I had found something. Friday morning, I drove to Sandra Okafor's office on the 4th floor of a building downtown, took the elevator up, and sat across from a woman with calm eyes and a yellow legal pad, and told her everything. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she uncapped her pen. "Do you have the documents with you?" she asked. I opened my purse and placed the originals on her desk. Sandra Okafor looked at them for a long time. Then she looked at me. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said. "You have a case." Sandra filed the first motions within 72 hours. She was efficient in a way that strangely reminded me of Richard. Not warm exactly, but exact. She explained what she was doing in plain language, filing a formal objection to the account changes because I had not given informed consent, asking for a full audit of the changed investment account, and sending a referral to the North Carolina State Bar's Financial Crimes Unit, which would then notify the bank. The process, she said, would not be fast, but it would be thorough. And in her view, the documents Richard had left were unusually complete. "Your husband was an engineer," she said, almost to herself, looking over the printed statements for the third time. "He was," I said. "He documented this the way an engineer documents a structural failure, step by step, cause and effect." I felt something tighten in my throat. "He always said that if you couldn't show your work, you didn't really know what you were doing." Sandra nodded. "It will serve you well." I drove home from her office and tried to return to the routine of my days. I called Patricia that evening, not to tell her everything, not yet, but because I needed to hear her voice. Patricia asked how I was doing, and I said I was managing, which was true in the narrowest way. She said she was thinking of coming to visit in March. I told her I would like that very much. The call from Michael came 4 days later, not from Karen, from Michael, which told me that Karen had studied the situation and decided that a son confronting his mother would land differently than a daughter-in-law doing the same. She was not completely wrong. Michael's voice when he called was doing that thing it always did when he was trying to manage something. It was too controlled, too even. Like a man reading from a script he had practiced. "Mom, we need to talk about what you've been doing." "What have I been doing, Michael?" "You hired a lawyer without talking to us." "I'm allowed to hire a lawyer." "Of course you are." A pause. "But you need to understand that what you're doing could damage this family. Audits, investigations. Do you know what that does to people's reputations, to their careers? Karen is in real estate. Her name is attached to transactions that will look what?" I asked. Silence. "Michael," I said, "I found the documents your father left me. I found the account statements. I found the emails. I know what happened." The silence on the other end of the line was a different kind of silence. Not thoughtful, but shocked. The silence of someone whose footing has suddenly shifted. Then Karen's voice came on the line. She had been there the whole time, listening. "Dorothy." Her voice was composed in a way Michael's had not been, harder, more deliberate. "You are making a serious mistake. What you think you found is not what it looks like." There were conversations between Richard and Michael about those transfers. They were agreed to. Richard understood what he was doing. "Then you will have no trouble proving that to the auditors," I said. "If you go forward with this," Karen said, and her voice dropped slightly. Not a shout, but something more controlled than a shout, which was worse. "You will lose your son. Is that what you want? To destroy your family over money at your age? At your age?" I held the phone very steadily. "If my son can be lost because his mother asks for what is legally hers, then I think that loss happened long before this phone call." I heard Karen make a sharp sound. Then Michael said, "Mom, I'm going to hang up now." I said, "Please do not contact me directly again." If you have something to say, say it to my attorney. I ended the call. I sat in Richard's armchair in the living room for a long time after that. My hands, when I finally looked at them, were completely still. I was surprised by that. I had expected them to shake. In the days that followed, there was no contact from Michael or Karen. Sandra told me that their own lawyer had been in touch, a firm Karen had used for real estate closings, which Sandra said was not a strong choice for this kind of case. The formal process had begun. There was nothing for me to do but wait and take care of myself. So that is what I did. I slept. I called Patricia, and we talked for a long time about nothing important. I walked in the neighborhood in the mornings, even when it was cold, because Richard had always said that movement was medicine. I made soup and ate it at the kitchen table with a book instead of the television. I was not happy, but I was not afraid, and there is a great deal of space between those two things where a person can rest. It was Betty Calhoun who saved me, though she would laugh at that description. Betty had been my closest friend for 30 years, since we had both served on the same church committee and discovered over a folding table covered with donation envelopes that we shared the exact same dislike for inefficient meetings. She was 70, a retired schoolteacher, a widow herself since 2019, and she had an unerring way of saying the true thing without making it feel like surgery. I called her on a Sunday morning, 3 weeks after the formal process had begun, and I told her everything, all of it. I had not told anyone else, not the neighbors, not my book club, not the women from my church, but I told Betty because keeping it fully to myself had started to feel like a weight I was carrying in my chest. She listened. She did not interrupt. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Dorothy, that woman has been waiting for Richard to die for years." It was not a kind thing to say. It was a true thing to say. How do you know? I asked. I watched her at family gatherings. The way she watched the room. People who love you look at you. People who are figuring out what you are worth look at the room. I thought about that for a long time. The indirect move from Karen came the following Tuesday. Not a phone call. Karen was too controlled for that. After the last conversation, it was a letter, hand-delivered by Michael to my mailbox, which told me a great deal about the nature of their arrangement. When it came down to it, Michael was Karen's errand boy in this. He drove the car and rang the doorbell and put the letter in the box and did not knock on the door. I found the letter when I went out for my morning walk. The letter was polite in language and sharp in purpose. It offered a private settlement, a lump sum payment to Dorothy of $75,000, set up as a voluntary family gift, in exchange for Dorothy withdrawing all formal proceedings. It framed this as a practical choice that would allow the family to avoid painful public exposure. And it contained a line near the end that I read twice. At this stage of your life, a long legal process may cost you more in time and health than the outcome would be worth. At this stage of your life. Karen had used a version of this phrase twice now. The first time on the phone, the second time in writing. I understood it as a strategy, not cruelty just for its own sake, but a careful guess that I could be made to feel old and tired and not worth the fight. It was, I realized, the same strategy someone uses when they underestimate a load-bearing wall. They push against it, expecting it to give, and instead find that it holds. I brought the letter to Sandra. She read it with a professional calmness that I had come to find reassuring. 75,000, she said, when the original amount was closer to 250. I said yes. She set the letter down. They're frightened. This offer shows how frightened they are. Should I be worried about the offer? No. About their next move. Moderately. She looked at me steadily. People who make this kind of offer and are refused tend to push harder before they fall apart. Be ready for that. I thanked her and drove home. That evening, I attended, for the first time, a support group for widows that met in the basement of the Lutheran Church on Marman Avenue. Betty had been going for 2 years and had gently suggested it 3 times before I finally said yes. I had resisted it the way I resisted most things that required strangers to see me closely, but I was glad I went. The group had 8 women, ranging in age from 59 to 81. They were funny and honest, and several of them had gone through estate problems that made mine feel, if not simple, then at least not unheard of. A woman named Gloria, who was 66 and had spent 3 years in probate court with her late husband's business partners, looked at me over her paper coffee cup and said, "The first year they test you to see how much you will put up with. After that, they know." I drove home from that meeting feeling, for the first time since February, something that was not grief and not anger, but something closer to solidarity. I was not alone in this. I had never been alone in it. I had simply forgotten to look around. They came on a Saturday morning in April. I saw the silver Audi in my driveway from the kitchen window while I was making coffee. I had not been warned. They had not called. That told me everything I needed to know about the visit before I even opened the door. Michael was wearing the expression he had worn as a teenager when he had done something wrong and hoped charm would cover the distance, a careful look of openness, sincerity, of being the kind of man who simply wanted to work things out. Karen stood slightly behind him, which was unusual. She was not a woman who stood behind people. She wore a soft camel-colored coat and carried a small paper bag. Pastries from the bakery on Lexington Avenue that she knew I liked. The bag sat on my coffee table during the whole visit, unopened. Neither of us mentioned it. We sat in the living room, Michael and Karen on the sofa, me in Richard's armchair, a pot of coffee on the table between us that I had made, because having something to do with your hands is useful in these situations. I did not pour for them. I poured for myself. Michael began. He was sorry, he said. Sorry for the phone call, sorry for the way things had turned out. He and Karen had been under a great deal of financial stress. The real estate market, the interest rates, 2 children in college at the same time. He did not use the word theft. He used phrases like borrowing against future inheritance and an informal arrangement and something Dad understood and approved of. He said all of this with the belief of someone who had practiced it until he half believed it himself. I noticed that he did not look me in the eye while he spoke. He looked at the coffee table, at his own hands, at the window, everywhere except at me. I listened without interrupting. This, too, I had learned from Richard. Let the structure show its own weaknesses, he used to say when reviewing engineering reports. Push too early, and you may miss where the rail break is. Then Karen spoke. She leaned forward a little, and her voice changed. It dropped lower, became intimate, woman to woman, in a way that was deeply planned. Dorothy, I know this has been a terrible year. Losing Richard, going through all of this alone, the last thing any of us want is for you to spend whatever time and energy you have left on lawyers and courtrooms. Think about what this is costing you. Not just money. Emotionally. You deserve peace. You deserve to spend this time with your grandchildren, with Patricia, not in depositions. She paused, and I could see her studying my face for any reaction, the way a person studies water for movement. If you drop the proceedings, she went on, we can work something out directly, something fair, something that doesn't hurt anyone. I looked at her for a moment. I thought about the paper bag of pastries. I thought about the word fair, how easily it comes to people who have taken something that did not belong to them, how they reach for it like a tool they believe they have the right to use. I thought about Richard at his desk in that gray house, printing those emails, recording every transfer, building the case he had been too frightened to use while he was alive. He had done that work alone. I was not going to let it mean nothing. I set down my coffee cup. What you took from me, I said, was about $250,000. The offer in your letter was $75,000. What you are describing now is something fair. What number did you have in mind? Karen's expression changed almost too slightly to notice. That's not really because fairness is a number. I said it isn't a feeling, and the number I can prove in court is $250,000 plus my legal costs. Michael started to say something. Karen touched his arm. A small, quick movement, and he stopped. We're not here to negotiate in your living room, Karen said. Her warmth was gone now. Not all at once, but the way clouds clear from a sky and you realize the blue was always there behind them. We came to give you a chance to handle this quietly. You have said no to that chance. I just want to make sure you understand what you are choosing. I understand perfectly, I said. I think you should go. Michael looked at me, really looked at me, not at Karen for direction, but at me. And for one moment, he looked like my son. Not the managed, practiced version, but the boy who cried when his dog died when he was 11 and slept with the light on for a week afterward. I had sat beside him on his bed then in the dark until he fell asleep. I still remembered the weight of his head against my shoulder. I wondered if he remembered it too. Then the expression shut like a shutter. Karen stood first. She picked up her bag, the pastry still untouched, and tucked it under her arm with a careful calmness that was, I thought, the most honest thing she had done all morning. She was not leaving them behind as a warm gesture. She was taking back what she had brought. They left. I listened to the Audi back out of my driveway and disappear down the street. I sat very still for a few minutes after that. What I felt was not confidence exactly. It was something more complicated. Fear, and I will not pretend it was not there. A real cold understanding that these two people had the means and the reason to make the next several months difficult. But underneath the fear was something harder. Richard had been afraid too, and his fear had cost both of us. I had made a different choice. I meant to keep making it. The pastry bag was gone. The case was not. The hearing was set for the third Thursday in May in a civil courtroom on the second floor of the Buncombe County Courthouse. Sandra had spent the weeks before it preparing me with the same thoroughness she brought to everything. We went over the documents again and again. She walked me through the order of the transfers, the paper trail, the emails, the account changes. She told me what to expect from Karen and Michael's lawyer, a man named Garrett Foss, who mostly handled real estate cases and whose understanding of estate fraud law, Sandra said with professional understatement, was not deep. She also told me what to expect from myself, that I might feel the urge to speak when I should stay silent, to react when I should stay still, and that the strongest thing I could do in that room was to be exactly what I was, a 72-year-old widow sitting calmly beside her attorney with a folder of perfect documentation. You do not need to act like anything, Sandra said the afternoon before. The evidence does the acting. You only need to be present. I dressed carefully that morning, a gray blazer over a white blouse, low heels because I had learned decades ago that physical comfort matters when you are going to sit in a hard chair for several hours and concentrate. I arrived before Michael and Karen. I found my seat beside Sandra, folded my hands in my lap, and waited. The courtroom was smaller than the ones I had seen on television, wood-paneled, lit by fluorescent lights, with the special stillness of official spaces. I looked at the judge, a woman in her late 50s with reading glasses on a chain, and I thought, she has sat in this room and heard versions of this story before, people lying about money, families breaking along the weak lines of inheritance. She would not be shocked. That was comforting in a way I had not expected. They came in together. Karen wore a well-cut navy dress and carried herself with the calm of someone who had decided calmness was the only tool she had left. Michael walked a little behind her, as he always did now. Garrett Foss sat beside them with the ease of a man who had not yet fully understood how much trouble he was in. Foss opened for their side with exactly what Sandra had predicted, a claim that the account changes had been made with Richard's full knowledge and spoken approval, that this had been a family arrangement for estate planning reasons, and that Dorothy's challenge represented a misunderstanding of her late husband's intentions. He was smooth. He was confident. He was building on sand. Sandra's opening was quieter and took half as long. She presented the documents in time order. She did not add opinions. She let the numbers speak. I watched the judge's face as Sandra went through each exhibit, the account statements, the change forms, the printed emails. The judge's expression did not change, but her pen moved steadily across her notepad, and it moved more when Sandra was speaking than when Foss was. The first break in the hearing came after 2 hours. I stood in the hallway with Sandra and drank water from a paper cup and said very little. Through the tall windows at the end of the corridor, I could see the May sky. Blue, truly blue, the kind of day that has no interest at all in the affairs of human beings and their betrayals. I was grateful for it. I breathed the recycled courthouse air, and I thought about the garden at home, which would need watering when I got back. When the proceedings started again, Karen was called to testify. She was calm at first, careful, deliberate, consistent with the story about verbal agreement. She spoke of Richard with an affection she used like a prop. She described their relationship as close, trusting, transparent. She used the word family often. I sat and listened and kept my face still. Sandra cross-examined her with the email chain. Not all of it. 3 emails in particular, the ones talking about finishing transfers before the estate situation becomes complicated. Emails dated 11 days before Richard died. Can you explain, Sandra asked, how the words before the estate situation becomes complicated fit with a voluntary, openly agreed upon family arrangement? Karen said the wording was casual, a shorthand, not proof that anything had been hidden. Sandra showed her the second email. In this message, you refer to your co-signatory as completely insulated. What were you insulating him from? I was referring to. Karen stopped. It was business language, real estate language. This is not a real estate account, Sandra said. This is a retirement investment account in Dorothy Whitmore's name. A silence fell over the room that felt different from the silences before it. Even Foss was still. I did not look at Karen. I looked at the judge, who was writing. Karen kept her calm for another 20 minutes. It was the account change documents that finally broke it. Specifically, a form requiring Dorothy's co-signature that the records showed had been filed without that signature. Sandra placed the form on the table and asked Karen to identify the signature on the co-authorization line. Karen said it was possible there had been an error in processing. Sandra asked whether Karen was familiar with the term signature forgery under North Carolina law. For the first time, Karen's eyes moved. Not to Sandra, not to her lawyer, not to the judge, but to Michael. It was a small movement, automatic, the reflex of someone who has run out of prepared answers and is looking for something to hold on to. Michael was looking at the table. He did not look back at her. That moment, Karen turning to him and finding nothing there, was, I thought, its own kind of verdict. Michael was called next. His testimony was the testimony of a man trying to hold 2 opposite stories together at the same time. He repeated the verbal approval story just as Karen had told it. But when Sandra asked him to describe the exact conversation in which Richard had agreed to the transfers, his story differed from Karen's in 3 specific details: the date, the place, and whether anyone else had been there. When Sandra pointed this out, placing both versions of testimony side by side on her legal pad, Michael looked at the table. He had been doing that all day, looking at the table, at his hands, at the floor, anywhere the truth was not pointing back at him. I had watched my son for 43 years, and I knew what that posture meant. It was the same posture he had used at 9 years old when he broke a neighbor's window and tried to explain how the ball had gotten there by itself. He had never been a good liar. He had simply found someone who was. Mr. Whitmore, Sandra said, did your father ever, in your direct presence, clearly authorize the transfer of funds from his personal retirement account to the holding company registered in your wife's name? Michael was silent for 7 seconds. I counted. He understood what we were doing, he said at last. That is not what I asked, Sandra said. The room was very quiet. Outside, somewhere, the May afternoon went on without us. The ruling came 6 weeks after the hearing. I was sitting in Sandra's office when her paralegal brought in the document. Sandra read it in silence, her expression professionally neutral, the way it had been all along. Steady, controlled, showing nothing until she had something worth showing. Then she looked up. Full restitution, she said. $247,000 plus your legal costs. The court has also accepted the referral to the Financial Crimes Unit. I sat with that for a moment. Outside Sandra's window, the downtown buildings held the late morning light the way they always did in summer, without caring, completely. And I thought how strange it was that the world looked exactly the same on the day something was resolved as it had on the day it began. And Karen's signature on the change form, the court found it to be unauthorized. That finding has been sent to the district attorney's office. Sandra set the document down. It's a felony, Dorothy. It will be prosecuted separately from the civil case. I nodded. I did not feel joy exactly. I felt something more like the ending of a long, tightly held strain. The way a structural flaw in a building feels, Richard once told me, when the repair is finally done and the weight is properly spread again. Not dramatic, not triumphant, just right, the way something is meant to feel when it returns to the place it should have been in all along. Sandra slid a copy of the ruling across the desk to me. I read the main paragraph twice, slowly, the way Richard had always taught me to read contracts, not for what they say, but for what they commit to. The words were clear, unmistakable. The court had ruled in Dorothy Ellen Whitmore's favor on all major counts. I thanked Sandra. She accepted it with the same professional calm she brought to everything. And then she said something I did not expect. Your husband did good work. He did, I said. He just waited too long to show it. You didn't, she said. The civil judgment could be enforced right away. Karen and Michael's lawyer filed a motion to delay enforcement, saying that the funds had been dispersed and would take time to liquidate. The court gave them 90 days. Sandra told me this was standard and that the judgment would be paid. Given Karen's real estate assets, there was no question of ability, only willingness, and willingness was no longer the important variable. Karen's real estate license came under review by the North Carolina Real Estate Commission within 3 weeks of the criminal referral. I did not go after that result. It was a result of the process, not a target I had chosen. But I will not pretend I was sorry. She had used her professional position, her industry connections, her understanding of how money moves through property deals, to systematically drain what Richard and I had built over 4 decades. The license had not been unrelated to what she had done. It had been central to it. The holding company was dissolved. The 3 receiving accounts were ordered frozen while the fraud investigation continued. The Financial Crimes Unit, Sandra told me, was especially interested in the person Karen had listed in the emails as DW, a mortgage broker named Dale Whitaker, who had helped with 2 of the transfers. He was not my problem. He was someone else's. But I noted, without satisfaction and without the opposite of satisfaction, that the circle was wider than just my kitchen table. Michael called me once after the ruling. I answered because he was still my son, and I was not fully sure what that meant now, but I knew it meant something. Some things last past the point where they are comfortable, and parenthood is one of them. Mom, he said. He sounded very tired. Not the managed tiredness of someone pretending to be worn out, but the real kind. The kind that comes from months of holding together a story that keeps splitting at the seams. Michael, I didn't. He stopped, tried again. I let her run too much of it. I knew it was wrong. I told myself it was just money, just accounting, that you would never notice, and Dad was sick anyway. And don't, I said, don't make that your story. You knew what you were doing. He did not argue. That, at least, was honest. I had expected excuses, explanations, the familiar shape of self-protection. Instead, he was quiet. And in that quiet, I heard something that might have been the beginning of accountability, or might simply have been exhaustion so deep it had no room left for anything else. I did not know which. I was not sure it mattered yet. I love you, I said. And what you did was a deep betrayal. Both of those things are true. I'm not going to pretend one cancels out the other. He said, I know. I ended the call. Patricia flew in from Portland the weekend after the ruling. By then, she knew. I had told her before the hearing because she deserved to know and because I was tired of managing information in a way that helped no one, least of all me. She had been quiet for a long time after I told her, a long, exact silence that I recognized as the silence of someone rearranging the furniture of a relationship she had thought she understood. Then she had said, I'm coming. That was all. That was enough. We sat on the porch together on Saturday evening with 2 glasses of wine, and the garden was doing what gardens do in June, quietly, steadily, without any interest in human trouble. The first roses had opened along the fence. Richard had planted those roses 20 years earlier and had never fully figured out how to prune them the right way. And every year they grew in a way that was a little wrong and completely alive. Patricia said, Dad would have liked Sandra Okafor. He would have, I said. He respected people who showed their work. We sat with that for a while, and the evening was warm, and neither of us needed to say anything more. Summer came, and with it a kind of lightness I had not expected. I kept the gray house. This surprised me when I decided it, and it surprised Sandra, and it certainly would have surprised Karen, who may have assumed I would sell it and be done with it. But it had been Richard's last project, his careful private act of preparation, and there was something in me that was not ready to let it go. I hired a painter, had the window boxes replanted with lavender and trailing white alyssum, and turned it into what it had perhaps always been meant to be, a place of my own. I went there on Tuesday mornings with coffee and a book and sat at the small desk and did whatever I liked. Sometimes I read. Sometimes I simply sat and listened to the neighborhood, a lawnmower 2 streets away, children somewhere, the quiet of a weekday morning. It was not just a house. It was proof that Richard had known me well enough to leave me something I did not yet know I needed. It was a small thing, but it was completely mine. Betty and I began walking together 3 mornings a week, something we had always meant to do and never arranged. We walked in the River Arts District in the early hours when the light was good and the tourists were not yet out. We talked about our husbands, our children, the gathered ordinary wisdom of long lives. Betty was, as she had always been, the best kind of company, someone who did not require you to perform. On one of our walks in late July, she said, "You seem different." I asked how. She thought about it and said, "Like you're inside your own life again instead of standing outside it watching." I turned that over carefully, the way Richard used to check measurements, and decided she was right. The widows group continued. Over time, I became one of the longer-standing members, and sometimes a newer woman would come in, shocked, newly alone, trying to manage some version of what I had managed, and I would find myself across the table from her saying the kinds of things Gloria had once said to me, that it was survivable, that you were allowed to be angry, that being old did not mean being without options. Patricia visited twice that summer, and we talked, truly talked, in ways we had not since she was a girl. She was, I came to understand, more like Richard than I had realized. Careful, private, loyal to the point of self-effacement. We were learning each other again, and it was good work. Michael was harder. The criminal proceedings against Karen moved slowly, as such things do. In September, she was charged with 3 counts of financial fraud and 1 count of document falsification. She hired a criminal defense attorney, a different firm, a better one than Garrett Foss, though in the end not good enough to change the basic problem with her case, which was that the documentation Sandra had presented was complete. She was not a woman who had made a careless mistake. She was a woman who had run a careful operation, and careful operations leave records. Her real estate license was formally revoked in August. She challenged it. The commission's ruling stood. I am told, not by anyone close to the case, but through the ordinary channels of a small city, that Michael and Karen sold their house in the fall. The sale was not voluntary in any real sense. It was liquidation. The life Karen had built, the referrals, the professional network, the reputation, had collapsed with a thoroughness that I suspect even she had not expected when she first decided that my retirement account was an opportunity. The children, my grandchildren, were staying with Karen's mother during the upheaval. This grieved me in a way the financial betrayal had not, because those children had done nothing, and they would carry the weight of it anyway. I wrote to each of them, a handwritten card with my phone number and the simple sentence that their grandmother loved them and was not going anywhere. One of them called me, Emma, who was 19. We spoke for 40 minutes. She cried. I did not, but only just barely. She came for dinner the following Sunday, ate 2 servings of chicken and rice, and fell asleep on the sofa afterward. I covered her with the quilt from Richard's reading chair and turned off the lamp. That was, I think, the evening I understood that I was going to be all right. Michael attended 2 of the criminal hearing dates without Karen, sitting in the back of the courtroom. He was not charged. The evidence showed that he knew, but placed the main working responsibility on Karen and her contact. I did not speak to him at the hearings. But at the second one, as we were leaving in opposite directions, he looked at me across the parking lot. Just looked. I looked back. Then I got in my car and drove to Betty's house for lunch, because that is what I had planned to do that afternoon, and I meant to keep doing the things I had planned. Karen was convicted in March on 2 of the 3 counts. She was sentenced to 18 months of probation, mandatory financial restitution, and community service. She was also, for the near future, essentially unemployable in her industry in this state. The 3 things together had a complete thoroughness to them. I was not glad she had suffered, but I was glad that what had been taken from me had a name and a consequence and a resolution. Those are different things. The tulips came up again in spring. I planted more, a new kind, deep burgundy, along the front walk, where they would be the first things seen from the street. Richard had always said the garden was the house's way of introducing itself. I thought it was time for a new introduction. Richard always said, measure twice, cut once. He meant it about engineering, but it was true about people too. I learned this. Grief makes you soft, and the wrong people know how to use that softness. But soft is not the same as weak. Soft things absorb pressure. They do not always break. If someone you love left you a locked door, go through it. You deserve to know what is on the other side. What would you have done in my place? I'd genuinely like to know. Leave a comment below, and thank you for listening.